Great morning to all of you. My name is Yash. I am the student of 11th Commerce in Sunrise Public School. Firstly, I would like to say thanks to Mrs. Aarti ma'am to provide me such a nice chance to speak here in front of you. Today I am here to speak on the topic of banks and types of banks. Firstly, I will explain you about banks. What is banks? A bank is an institution which accepts deposit and advances for the purpose of earning profit. Or we can say that a bank is an organization which accept deposit, lend money and provide other agency functions. Now there are five main types of banks. Number one is commercial bank, number second is industrial bank, agriculture bank, regional bank, and fifth one is other apex banking institution. Firstly, I will tell you about commercial bank. What is commercial bank? Commercial banks are those banks which accept deposit from general public and provide short-term loans to manufacturers and traders. Commercial bank is classified into two categories. Number one is foreign commercial bank and another one is Indian commercial bank. Foreign commercial banks are those banks which have their branches in India and some other countries also. Example of foreign commercial banks are Citibank, Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of America and other etc. Now about Indian commercial bank. Indian commercial banks are those banks which have their branches in India only. Indian commercial banks are divided into two types. Number one is public sector bank and another one is private sector bank. Public sector bank are controlled by the government. Minimum 51% of its capital is taken by government and they are 12 in numbers. Example of public sector banks are Punjab National Bank, State Bank of India. Private sector banks are those banks which are controlled by a private sector or a group of individuals. For example, HDFC Bank and Jammu and Kashmir Bank. Now about industrial banks. Industrial banks are those banks which provide loans to industries, or these banks help in establishing new industrial units. These banks is divided into two levels. Number one is national level and state level. On national level there are four banks which provide loans to industries, and on state level there are only two banks which provide loans to these industrial development. Now about agriculture banks. Agriculture banks are those banks which provide loans to agriculture work. These banks provide short-term loans for purchasing seeds, fertilizers, and long-term loans are required for purchasing land. These banks is also classified into two categories. Number one is Cooperative Bank and second one is Land Development Bank. Cooperative banks provide short-term loans which is help in buying the seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And land development banks are those banks which help in buying land and tractors and other farming instruments. Now about regional bank. Regional banks are those banks which are established in 1975 to enhance the banking facilities in rural areas. The main functions of these banks is to provide loans to small traders and farmers. Their total capital 50% is provided by the central government and 35% of its capital provided by commercial banks and 15% of its capital provided by the state government. The main function, these banks are sponsored by some commercial banks and functions of commercial and cooperative banks are found in it. Now about other apex banking institution. In this category, other main banks of the country are included. The number one is central bank. Central banks are the other main banks of central bank is the main bank of a country. It plays an important role in a country monetary and banking system. These banks issues currency and control the other banks of a country. In India, the central bank is the Reserve Bank of India, and in England, Bank of England, and in America, Federal Reserve Bank are the central banks. In 1668, the first central bank is established in Sweden. Now about Exim Bank. Full form of Exim is Export-Import Bank. These banks are established on January 1, 1982. These banks are established to enhance the foreign trade. These banks are the main function of these banks is to provide assistance to engage in import and export work. Now about National Housing Bank. These banks are established in 1988 The main function of these banks is to provide the loan on houses. Now about Industrial Reconstruction Bank of India. The main function of this bank is to provide the loans for rehabilitation of industries. Now about NABARD. The full form of NABARD is National Agriculture Bank for Rural Development. The main function of these banks is to provide loans to agriculture work. These banks provide short-term, medium-term and long-term loans to agriculture work. Now we will again revise the types of banks. Number one is commercial bank, which is classified into two categories: foreign commercial bank and Indian commercial bank. Indian commercial banks are also divided into two categories: public sector bank and private sector bank. Industrial banks. Industrial banks are also classified into two levels. Number one is national level and another one is state level. Agriculture bank. Agriculture banks are those banks. These banks are also classified into two categories. Number one is cooperative bank and another one is land development bank. Regional banks. I have already explained about regional banks and other banking institution. In this bank, other main banks of the country are included. Number one is Central Bank, Exim Bank, National Housing Bank, Indian Reconstruction Bank of India and NABARD. This is all from my side. Thank you and have a nice day.